Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, a couple of days ago, I did a reaction to a brand new channel that I hadn't reacted to before called Decades. And I asked this community if we couldn't push their subscriber count over 10,000 in less than 24 hours. And you guys did it, as I knew that you would. And at last count, they're at about 10,500. And they made a second part to the video that I first reacted to and dedicated it to yours truly. So I am grateful for that, but really it should be dedicated to you guys, our Vlogging Through History community, for supporting his channel. And as I told them, I said, listen, I didn't really do anything for you guys. All I did was shine a light on a channel that was making great historical content so that more people would know about it. They're the ones doing the work. They're the ones who have created the content that is worth subscribing to. So I thought it would be fun to dive into a longer one of their videos because this one caught my attention. If you're not familiar with the times that I've shared some of my family's story, my immigrant ancestors who came from the West Midlands of England and then actually went up to Glasgow, Scotland for a while before coming to America, were publicans, as they were once called. They were tavern keepers. They owned pubs, multiple pubs. A couple in a town known as Tipton, which is very near to Birmingham, and then later on in Glasgow. And in fact, the pub that my family ran in Glasgow is still there. It's called the Old Toll, and I got to visit the Old Toll when I was in Glasgow last summer. So I thought it would be very interesting to dive into the history of pubs just because of my own family connections to the history of pubs. So the link is in the description to the original content. Highly recommend you check out Decades. They have fantastic stuff, really interesting stuff, and they have some on-site stuff as well that I eventually want to dive into, visiting some castles, things like that. But let's take a look at the history of pubs. I'm curious as to what's going on here. I think you got enough staples on there, buddy.
Get in the car, Jones. We're getting you drunk. Not there, not a taxi service.
Nice. I like the intro. That was cool.
Pubs. After a tough week at work, nothing quite hits the spot like a trip down to the boozer for a crisp pint of lager. Nothing quite sizzles the senses like a bready Guinness, maybe an overly sugary cider. And if you're feeling particularly done with the universe, there's always a nice, strong spirit to wipe your mind of the day's stresses.
So I think that we as Americans, and granted, I'm an American who is very much an Anglophile. I am in love with all things related to British culture. You know that from the fact of me having a Union flag hanging here in my office and recruitment poster from the British Army in World War I. So I've always felt a strong connection because most of my family roots go through the UK. But I don't know that we as Americans fully understand the pub culture. And I think part of it is because the U.S. is such a big country and we're more spread out, there's not always necessarily as much of a sense of community and having kind of that local pub that you live by, because very often in many parts of our country, we don't even live in areas where we could walk to a place. We have to drive everywhere we go, right? So I think maybe in the cities, a lot of people have like a local bar and stuff. I'm curious to know, Americans who are watching, do you have like a local pub, a bar that you go and hang out with, and do you have like a regular crowd that goes there? Because we don't have anything like that here where I live. I mean, I shouldn't say nowhere because there are bars, but...
Pubs, short for public houses, are a fundamental aspect in British culture and have been for centuries. No matter where you go in the United Kingdom, you can be certain that you're never more than a 5-minute walk from somebody's local. Whether you're in the centre of a city or the middle of absolutely nowhere, pubs are an absolute staple of what it means to be British.
And they mentioned Guinness, and I had my very first Guinness at a pub in London a couple of months ago. Had a chance to sit down with my friend Joris from the Netherlands, who was our tour guide on my trip there. And he happened to be coming into King's Cross Station, and I was staying at a hotel right by there, so we were able to go out and get a couple pints together.
For many in the UK, a boozer is where a person experiences the best and worst memories of their lives. It's where we meet our friends and catch up. It's where we make new friends whilst vomiting into a toilet, and then never see them again. It's where we make plans that we almost certainly will never carry out. It's where we unwind after a hard week, or get wound up and kicked out by the bouncer. Alcohol can be a contributing factor to some of our best and worst decisions.
Nice. I think one of the things that would attract me the most about the pub culture is also because of the sports. And obviously I'm a huge European football fan. And I would love to be able to go down to a pub and watch the game for the local team. You know, if I was in West Brom, to be able to go down to a pub and watch the West Brom game with a bunch of people. That part really draws me in.
The pub is where we partake in a variety of activities: drinking, eating, drinking, pub quizzes, drinking, terrible karaoke, drinking, playing pool, playing darts, discussing important issues such as politics or football, whining about our significant others, complaining about the weather, and of course, more drinking. This has been the case for centuries, but sadly, in the past 2 decades or so, pubs have seen a rapid decline in the UK. That being said, across Britain, there are still tens of thousands of pubs still open and serving that delightful, rewarding pint that we all crave.
So, British viewers who are watching this, what is the reason for that? Is there a reason why the pub culture is declining over the last couple of decades? Do you know why?
But how did this jovial tradition, these pillars of our communities, begin? In today's video, Connor Jones's 2003 Nissan Almera Special Edition got stolen, so he is going to get blackout drunk as we visit some nearby boozers. Meanwhile, I will assume the role of designated driver, and together we are going to be exploring the history of pubs.
Nice. Giant mousetrap?
Before we proceed with too much self-destructive behaviour, let's actually get into the history. Today's history lesson dates back roughly 2,000 years ago.
Roman Empire.
The native alcoholic beverage of Britain prior to the Roman Empire's arrival was ale. The construction of a network of Roman roads led to the establishment of shops, known as taverni, which translates from Latin to shops, believe it or not. A taberna would be an epicenter for commerce and would typically have a single room shop utilised as a domestic dwelling where cooked food and wine would be served.
So you have to remember that even in earliest times, that up until very recently, water was not necessarily the safest thing to drink, right? So you had to come up with some alternative. And typically, I mean, it's not like you had Coke and Pepsi that you could drink. It wasn't that fruit juices were being mass produced. So you really had the choice between dirty water that could kill you and various forms of alcohol.
These tabernae were commonplace across the Roman Empire and before it likely ancient Greece. However, it's believed the Romans would greatly increase their numbers as they expanded into the Mediterranean. As the Roman Empire expanded, tabernae would be established within indoor markets and anywhere else with frequent commerce. They would often feature wide doorways and be open to the street. They wouldn't exclusively function for the purpose of selling wine and food, but rather as structures that housed all kinds of sales, from luxury and exotic items to a simple scoff to keep a browser fed. The taverni present in the British Isles would adapt to provide locals with ale, and the singular word taberna would likely be distorted, marking the origins of the name tavern.
So many of the names that exist today have some ancient origin, and we're just like a natural progression of that. And one of the cool places you can see that played out is in, if you've ever seen the show that's on Netflix, The Last Kingdom, they show the names of those towns as they existed at that time. Whenever you enter a town, like, right? So like when it shows a scene that's taking place in York, it'll say Ephewich, which was the name for York at that time, or Eboracum, which is what the Romans called it. And then eventually that became Jorvik and then York. So there are these progressions that happen of these town names over time. And the same is true with words like tavern. They all have these origins that go back to some other name. It's really fascinating to study that history.
The Romans would leave Britain in the early 5th century, and these places would effectively be left behind. Along with it, the infrastructure, and in failing that, the idea to establish alehouses or taverns. Easily accessed shelter along main roads to provide food and drink to travellers and locals alike. Over the next few centuries, these taverns would see the invading Angles, Saxons, and Scandinavians, to name a few.
So think about this the same way, like here in the States, you have exits on highways where all of the fast food places are, right? All the restaurants, all the hotels. They tend to put those at places where the maximum amount of traffic is going to go by and potentially stop. Same thing was true with these taverns, right? They're going to be on the main roads, on places where a lot of travelers are going to pass by, so you get a lot of foot traffic, a lot of potential customers.
Adapting to suit the needs of the varying cultures of their clientele. Anglo-Saxons would establish these alehouses, and they would quickly become a popular meeting location for folk to socialise and discuss problems and solutions within their respective communities. These taverns would become integral to travel across the British Isles.
And, you know, there's a reason that in many cultures, the beer halls or the taverns became the places that political movements were founded, right? Look at National Socialism in Germany in the aftermath of World War I. That was happening in beer halls. That's where people were gathered. That's where you had an audience. That's where you could interact with people. That goes back much, much further. It's millennia that has been a place where people have met.
Shelter, food and drink would never go amiss along trade routes. Pilgrims, merchants and other travellers of all kinds would utilise the hospitality to their advantage along their journeys. Taverns would also slowly develop into inns, providing a place for guests to stay the night, safe and sound. Alehouses or taverns would develop a political significance too,
There you go.
with many laws, rules and discussions dedicated specifically to their very existence, as their consistency over the centuries granted them power over the time's economy. For example, in the mid-10th century, Anglo-Saxon King Edgar of England would supposedly attempt to impose limitations on how many alehouses any one village could contain, as well as supposedly passing a law known as the Peg, a measure that restricted the amount of alcoholic beverages any one individual could consume.
Interesting that even 1,000 years ago that was a concern. So you got a couple reasons for that. Number one, obviously to regulate and keep people from getting drunk all the time, because drunk people tend to do stupid things, and that's when you end up with all kinds of other sorts of crimes that you have to deal with. But also limiting the places where people could gather keeps there from being mobs that regularly gather in places, and that kind of helps to suppress any revolt type things that could happen.
Ethelred the Unready, king of the English in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, would even impose a fine for breaching the peace at alehouse meetings. They would become almost sacred sites in their own right. Conflict was to be left at the door, and all that was found within was peace, alcohol, and conversation. And with that, it's time to stop at a pub so Connor can have his first drink. But not me, I'm a good boy. I'm driving. You see, Connor? This is how you stop your car getting nicked.
Yeah, you're a bit of a bell end, Jake.
See, now they can't steer it if they wanted to. See?
This is a pub. Does very nice beer and food.
I'm curious where that one is because my fourth great grandmother was a Betts. That was her last name, and they lived in Birmingham. They were gun manufacturers. Her family. So curious where that one's at. Okay, so it is in Greater Manchester. It's up here north of Manchester, southwest of Leeds. So interesting. I mean, my Betts family came from Birmingham down here, but I don't know where they came from before that. Maybe from Manchester, but that's pretty cool to see that.
This pub was the Oud Betts pub, located just outside of Rochdale in Lancashire. Or is it Greater Manchester now? I guess it really depends on who you ask. But they serve some nice pints and also some nice food.
I don't need to burp anymore. Oh, pathetic.
So I love how they're doing this. They're interspersing the history of pubs with showing them experiencing a pub today. It's pretty cool. It's a neat way to tell the story.
While Connor sleeps off his one Guinness, let's crack on with the history. Into the Middle Ages, taverns or alehouses were on the cusp of evolution once again. Before this time, travellers seeking refuge would typically have to seek accommodation at a monastery. However, over the next few centuries, the demand for hospitality to this extent grew, alongside the increase in pilgrims and travelling merchants. Now, taverns could also function as inns, or what we might know today as a hotel.
And that's true. The tavern that my fourth great grandfather ran on Old Church or Upper Church Lane in Tipton had, I think, 4 different dwellings on the property where people could stay.
Or more accurately, a bed and breakfast. Not only did taverns serve food and drink, but they could also provide a bed for a weary traveller to rest, safe from the dangers of the outdoors. It's also believed that at one point or another, inns would find themselves having some form of military purpose too. Inns could function as recruitment centres, driving up enlistment into armed service.
And that makes sense because, again, you're talking about this as being kind of a community center, right? If this is an area that people are familiar with, it's a natural gathering place. It's a place that you could sign up recruits. It's a place that you could have political gatherings. It's a place you can pass information on to people quickly so that people are aware of some development that has happened because they don't have TVs at home or radios. So this becomes kind of a central meeting point for all sorts of things.
Many open today claim to have served this purpose. However, it's unclear if these pubs even existed at the times they claim to have done so. Regardless, it's likely that popular attractions within communities were potentially ideal staging grounds for recruitments, especially when looking for what's effectively cannon fodder. Couple that with the fact that everybody was sloshed on ale, potentially impressionable and in an impulsive and reckless mood. Alcohol isn't exactly known to lead to rational decision making.
And I can see a situation in those cases where you would get people liquored up before you presented them with the opportunity to serve, right? You don't have the laws that you have today where people could argue in court that they weren't in a position to be able to make that decision, right? Hey, you signed up. I don't care if you were drunk or not.
Taking advantage in that during a time where it was allowed was simply good maths. Moving on from that, however, taverns were not exclusive to England or even the British Isles, but their purpose as refuge for travellers and crucial aspects of the economies they were a part of spanned more or less the entirety of Europe. France exhibited taverns and inns from as far back as the early 1300s. They would function as major attractions for evening dining out. They would offer food and drink. Their main function was to serve wine, a drink so heavily revered by the French that children would drink it with their dinners at school up until recently. French taverns and inns would evolve into cabarets, where in-house entertainment would set these places apart from the rest of Europe.
So what you're going to see happening in this situation, right, is that the unique aspects of different cultures in different places is going to give a very distinct flavor to the nature of those taverns, those meeting houses, right? So in Germany, there are the beer halls and everything you associate with kind of the beer hall culture. And in England, it has evolved much more into a place where people gathered to watch football. And in France, it was about wine and entertainment and all the same things. But as time goes by, they develop in different ways.
Germany today is well known for its passionate and well-made beer, so it's no surprise that the Holy Roman Empire, which encompassed what we know today as Germany, saw drinking as an act of social status. However, the region followed well-structured social norms regarding it, so drinking was tolerated provided men upheld their households and followed tavern rules. Women considered to be respectable were not allowed inside taverns unless accompanied by their husbands, and drunk women were seldom tolerated. However, women could impose control over their spouse's drinking habits should they get out of hand, and provided those rules were followed, it was respected. And then the Scandinavians loved to drink to excess. Need I say more? Of course, taverns, or tavern equivalents, would be popular establishments there. The recurring theme is almost every region of Europe had some form of tavern-like business model.
And that just makes sense, right? Because number one, alcohol is going to be a key component in life because of the aforementioned issues with drinking water and not really a lot of other alternatives. But then people are naturally social creatures, and so we are going to tend to gather in places. And so it just makes sense that in every culture in Europe that you're going to have some form of taverns developing.
Social structures and societal norms. Drinking in public with your pals was always going to be more jovial than drinking alone, especially in a time before Twitter and televised sports. The tavern would also make its way to North America, but we're not quite there yet. Back in England...
And hey, look at the founding of the United States. The first battles of the Revolution, Lexington and Concord. One of the key components of that was that the militia gathered at the tavern there in Lexington. It's one of the historic sites that you visit when you go there, is the big tavern right on Lexington Green. The tavern was a key component in all of that.
The significance of inns led to the formation of a hostlers guild in London in the mid-15th century. This guild would evolve into the worshipful company of inn holders and functioned as a traders' association for hostlers. And then alehouses, taverns and inns would become collectively known as public houses around the time of the late 15th and early 16th centuries, likely under the reign of King Henry VII. This name would be shortened to pub, a name that has become iconic in the eyes, ears, hearts, stomachs, brains, nervous systems, livers and pancreas of the British public ever since. It's at this point that the pub, on paper at least, was officially born.
And what's so cool about the history of pubs in the UK is when you go there, there are these pubs that are hundreds and hundreds of years old and just have such an incredible history going back to the 1500s, even sometimes earlier than that.
Still a far cry from pubs as we know them today. Anyway, before we get to that, it's time to stop off at our next pub, the Red Lion, located in Hawkshaw, because Jones needs another pint.
It's at Red Lion. Nice boozer, nice ale, nice atmosphere, nice food.
Clearly, Jones is taking the loss of his car quite hard.
Go cockeyed again.
Somebody should really stage an intervention before this gets messy, but I'm not his mum, so I don't really give a
I think we should move onwards.
And that we most certainly will.
That's fantastic. Can I just say, and maybe it's part of me is because I just love British humor in general, but I absolutely love this guy's presentation style. It's so entertaining. I hope you guys are enjoying it too.
The expansion of public houses, taverns, inns or alehouses, whichever name takes your fancy, embedded itself in Britain's economy, due to beers and ale being safer to consume than the standard drinking water of the times, which was quite dirty and rife with disease. Under those circumstances, it is understandable why the nation simply couldn't get enough of them. The 15th century would also see the dawn of licensing laws. Henry VII passed an act against vagabonds and beggars in 1496.
So Henry VII, just to kind of recap where he comes from, he's Henry Tudor, right? He is the first of the Tudor dynasty. He's the father of Henry VIII, grandfather of Elizabeth, Mary, etc. And he is an ancestor of every monarch in the UK, starting with his son. because it's through his daughter that the Scottish royal family is eventually going to inherit the throne.
Empowering justices of the peace to enforce that alehouses were registered and licensed. These taverns or old pubs would provide food and lodging, as well as stabling and feed for horses. Their communal dining areas were popular settings for local town meetings. They were popping up everywhere. Many were simply houses to begin with that had spare rooms and spare beds. Unlike today, where you could walk straight into a pub or an inn, an innkeeper would have to open the door for guests and decide who they would accommodate. The prospective guest would need to convince the owner to grant them a bed for the night. However, some areas, specifically certain English townships, would form laws dictating that innkeepers do their utmost to provide all visitors with a bed.
If you ever see those sheep and you see the color on their backs, it was explained to me when we were in the Scottish Highlands, because there's sheep everywhere there. It has something to do with knowing whether or not they've mated with another sheep, I think, because the paint was on certain ones, and that helps them to figure that out.
Or a bev, whichever they needed. Say in, bro, got any nicotine? How do you get in there then? Like, what's that about? Like, how do you manage it? What are your secrets? That's an unruly beast right there.
That's an unruly beast right there. That's how he got in.
He wants to scrap. I can tell he's sizing us up.
He is.
He's like, I'm gonna go do you in. A key
That's
aspect
awesome.
to the evolution of the inn was its atmosphere. An inn, tavern or pub would most commonly be a dimly lit establishment due to the use of tallow candles. Low lighting is always a cosy feeling, and a lot of places, even today, have remained faithful to that archetype of aesthetics. Sanitation was a different issue. Most inns used a barrel as a toilet, and it would be emptied every morning. Beds would be used for more than one traveller at a time. Sometimes several could slide into one bed for the night.
Yeah, that seems weird to us today, but at the time it wasn't, and it was very common for men who were roommates to sleep in the same bed together. It wasn't seen the way it might be seen today.
As strange as that might be today. But this was a time before sanitation and privacy were really valued as highly as they are in modern society. I know I wouldn't want to share a bed with this clown, so having to do so with strangers would send me over the edge. Due to the volume of travellers, irregular taverns and public houses would come and go, but inns would see a much more consistent clientele. Thus, it wasn't long before inns would easily be identified as older and grander establishments. Today the distinction is no longer formal, and many pubs can be seen today sporting the word inn in their names. Once upon a time, these places may have functioned as coaching inns, or maybe it's just used in jest to invite passers-by inside, to welcome them in.
Look at that landscape. That's so awesome. I love it. Beautiful.
By the late 16th century, it is estimated that roughly 20,000 public houses encompassing various forms existed in England and Wales. The hospitality industry was booming across the kingdom, as it was always destined to do so. They were pillars of their respective communities. A boom in the industry was a given. So with all that said, it's time to go for our next drink, because if we allow Jones to become sober again, he'll start talking about trains. And believe me, you don't want that. So we're in Burrs Country Park in Bury. A lovely place to take in some scenery, if that's your thing. Or you could just be daft like Connor and film a heron taking a dump. Anyway, the reason why we came here is for the pub at the centre of this lovely park. Well, technically not the centre, but you get the picture I'm trying to paint. That pub is, of course, the Brown Cow. They do lovely pints and food, and the place is always full of dogs. Many pubs in the UK are dog-friendly. I wouldn't say all of them are, but it certainly isn't uncommon.
And another thing that I've noticed, especially in places like London and very populated areas, is you'll see often there's so many people at a local pub that they can't fit inside. Some of these places get really, really packed. And when the pub we went to, it was like on a Thursday night in the King's Cross area, and it was overflowing with people. You can drink outside because they don't have the laws like we do here in the States where you can't have an open container outside. It's not a big deal there. You can do that.
The only reason I mention this really is so that we can all enjoy some lovely dog stock footage together. I'm sure you appreciate it if you love dogs as much as I do. I would use footage of my own dog, but sadly, he's going to be dead for the foreseeable future. Man, that was heavy. Maybe I need a drink. Don't remind me. Of course, then we had to go for an evening walk to ensure that Connor didn't die from moderate alcohol consumption, because that's a concern.
He did that with that extra bit of panetta. Oh, I'm dead. Right, this is a modern art installation. Connor Jones proving that the giant mouse trap does indeed not work.
There's no cheese on this fucker.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what they're trying to catch, but the contraption's faulty, so maybe they've just left it.
It says picnic area on it.
George Washington.
The first pub or tavern established in colonial America opened in the early 17th century. Colonial Americans had an affinity for a variety of distilled spirits, but their poison of choice was rum. Throughout most of New England, taverns among the colonies were...
And if you grew up in the States, you probably learned about the triangle trade in school, where it had to do with the importation of slaves from Africa, but also the sugar and rum that were being produced in the Caribbean, which were then brought to the United States, and all of that sort of stuff. So yeah, rum was a big deal. The more elite people that liked a different kind of drink, they tended to drink Madeira, which is a specific kind of alcohol that was very popular among like the gentry, things like that.
Referred to as ordinaries to begin with. Ordinaries were influential in development of new settlements, functioning as communal gathering locations of choice. Taverns in North America would also function for more purposes than just serving alcohol and providing a social space, due to the infrastructure's infancy, being used as courtrooms, churches, trading posts and post offices, to name a few of their functions. The further out a tavern was from the established settlements, the more roles it undertook, with those on the cusp of the frontier serving the purpose of being a trading post for those who were venturing forth to settle deeper into what was unknown territory at that time. Colonial taverns would typically consist of two-storey log cabins, with 2 rooms to a floor. The ground floor would function as the public space and bar, and the upper floor was used for bedrooms. Due to the circumstances of their establishment, they'd become pretty much their own thing off the bat. Back in Britain...
And then the whole thing happens again when America is settling the West in the 19th century, right? You have these huge buildings that sometimes would have like a restaurant and tavern on the ground floor. Part of the building might be a general store, and then upstairs you might have the jail and the courthouse all in one building.
Britain in the 18th century, the consumption of gin would spike as an alternative to French brandy during a time of secular and religious turmoil between Britain and France, specifically in the major cities. With brandy imports being restricted, gin was popular amongst the poor because it was cheap. It was also less taxable, and the Treasury took a hit, beginning the gin craze. Parliament would pass several major acts in an attempt to curb the consumption of gin.
So just a great example of how people find ways around the law, right? And then the law has to catch up. And okay, they're going to tax this kind of alcohol. Well, they haven't taxed this alcohol yet. And in the early part of the United States, you're going to have what's called the Whiskey Rebellion, because the U.S. government has very few avenues through which to gain tax revenue, right? Because it's not able to get tax revenue from, say, property taxes. There's no income tax. So they basically have a couple of options. One is import taxes, tariffs. The other thing that they're going to do is they're going to tax basically like a sin tax, right? They're going to tax things like alcohol. And that leads to a rebellion by Southwest Pennsylvania farmers who are making their living producing alcohol, which is now going to be taxed. So that's going to hurt them. And it becomes a big deal.
Now, I don't understand much about the gin craze, but if I look at my mum for long enough, I get a pretty good idea. However, this problem was resolved by the 1750s, which means we get to move on to the birth of the pub as we know it today. Yes, everything up until this point has been convoluted pre-context. You're welcome. The concept of the modern pub would begin to develop in the 19th century, with the rapid developments of infrastructure during the Industrial Revolution.
Right, so often we think of the Industrial Revolution and how it impacts industry, right? It impacts how things are made. It impacts what is made. It impacts people coming more into the cities and leaving, kind of the farm and rural culture for the cities, but it also has an impact on the nature of pubs, the nature of gatherings. It has an impact on who is able to vote and who owns property and laws that are passed about working and all of. I mean, the Industrial Revolution has this avalanche effect on every part of culture,
which saw small towns become big cities and vast rises in local populations. Prior to this, alehouses were common along rural roads, which were for the most part off the beaten path. Typically, the only beverages available at old pubs would be beer, often brewed by the owner of the establishment themselves. However, under the massive expansion of the Industrial Revolution and the demand for beer and places to house social engagement, many regions would be transformed, and as a result, many out-of-the-way pubs found themselves now as central community hubs, with a large repertoire of regulars and competition to contend with. With this demand, these old rural pubs needed to evolve into more urban houses. Acquiring alcoholic beverages from third parties would become a must to keep up with the demand. And by the mid-19th century, pubs would become purpose-built, which allowed pubs to stand out from private houses, thus allowing these buildings to be instantly recognisable. This was the true birth of pubs as we know them today. As before, many pubs, taverns and inns evolved from what were simply residences. It was around this time when beer pumps began to emerge. Though originally invented by Dutchman John Lofting in the late 17th century, beer engines only really began to gain popularity going into the 19th century. This innovation allowed a larger number of customers to be served in a shorter time frame.
And again, that's just natural evolution of things, right? You are looking for ways to, especially when people are gathered more in cities and you're going to have a bunch of pubs in a close area. The way it used to be, where you were out on a rural road somewhere, it wasn't like there were 4 other pubs people had a choice to go to. They had to go to yours because yours was the one that was there along the route they were traveling. Now people have options. So now you have to start competing against others. You have to find ways to make money, and often that is about volume, right? So how can we get more people served in a quicker amount of time and therefore bring our costs down to compete against the other pubs,
allowing for business to accelerate and profits to be maximised. This John Lofting character would also invent and patent fire hoses and fire engines. Between fighting fires and creating a swifter means for alcohol to be served, I think it's fair to say we're dealing with a man who has his priorities in order. For the working class, life during the Industrial Revolution was difficult, and large portions of workers' wages would be spent in these drinking establishments. Terrible living and working conditions led to very unhappy people.
And so, especially here in the States, but also in other countries, here's where you have the beginning of the temperance movement, right? Because as men have pubs more accessible and they're immediately spending a lot of their wages on alcohol, you have women and their families who are seeing the negative result of alcohol and they're protesting. And it's going to be primarily women and mothers who are going to start this temperance movement. And in my own family, we got to see this firsthand. I just wrote a book about the Whitaker family, which were my family that owned pubs. But when they came to America, and he owned, my fourth great grandfather owned what was called a saloon in Cleveland, his son apparently fell into alcoholism. And we found a Supreme Court case, Ohio Supreme Court, where my third great grandmother took a local pub here in Northeast Ohio to court because they kept serving her husband alcohol, and he was basically worthless to his family of 16 children because of it. And she won. And it ended up going all the way to the Ohio Supreme Court because the people who ran the pub didn't own the property, and the owners of the property found themselves being hurt by this financially, and so it was a big mess. But my third great grandmother did eventually win. But that was her way of fighting back against this local pub that was basically destroying their family as she saw it.
So rowdiness was fairly common when alcohol was added to the mix, but for many the pub was still a home away from home. Towards the end of the 19th century, due to the increased competition to secure markets and by extension profits for specific products, breweries began to purchase local pubs, afterwards directly employing staff to operate them. This led to a change in how many pubs functioned and became known as the birth of the tied house system. By the end of the 19th century, roughly 90% of public houses in England were owned and managed by breweries.
Wow.
Meaning the only means from here for these breweries to grow their own profits was to go to war with one another. Buyouts were commonplace and properties aggressively changed hands frequently. By the 1980s, only 6 large brewers remained in the UK, and they became known as the Big Six. The government would step in a ploy to increase the number of free houses in the UK, forcing big breweries to sell their tied houses via the beer orders in 1989.
So is that where the term free house comes from then? Is that it's a pub that is not owned by one of these breweries? That's really cool. I didn't know that.
The supply of beer order of 1989 restricted the number of tied houses that a brewery could own in order to avoid the industry becoming monopolised through a lack of competition for consumers, though at this point it effectively was. The number of tied pubs a brewery could own was now limited to 2,000, which is still a significantly large number.
And if you've got 6 main breweries, you're looking at 12,000 pubs. But how many are in the UK? I'm guessing a lot more than that.
And also required landlords to allow for guest beers to be sourced by tenants and not dictated by the landlords. This order would be lifted in 2003, by which time the market had significantly changed, with no one company dominating the beer industry.
So I just had to look it up while he was talking about this. In 2019, according to the British Beer and Pub Association, there are 47,200 public houses in the UK. 23,400 of them are independent, almost 14,000 owned by pub companies, and nearly 10,000 owned by breweries.
Which brings us nicely to the modern day. Exploring all of this history, it's immediately apparent why pubs have taken hold in British culture. They're everywhere. Easy establishments to find, ready to serve you a fine beverage to end the day, or to start it if it's match day. The pub is a staple of life in the British Isles. It's where communities truly come together. It's where friends meet. It's where one finds an almost never-ending supply of beer. It's a shame that the number of pubs are in decline now in the UK, with many more businesses struggling to make ends meet in wake of the pandemic and its lockdowns, and soaring costs to living. It is sad to see places where people once drank closing their doors for good, with the number of open pubs in the UK reaching record lows in the early months of 2022.
Wow.
In spite of this, there are still dozens of thousands of pubs with their doors wide open, serving pints to people across the country every day. It's estimated that a third of Britain's population visits a pub at least once a fortnight, which is far from an all-time high, but it's still an absurdly large number of people.
So the UK population is around 67 million. I was just sitting there doing the math. So you've got one pub for every about 1,400 people. When you figure a lot of them being children, the number is much smaller. But I am surprised there's not more than that.
The pub and its history is far from exclusive to England and the United Kingdom. Drinking establishments can be found all over the world, and they come in all different shapes and sizes. It's impossible to narrow down where the idea originated from to begin with. But today, even in decline, the pub is massively popular in the UK. In fact, it's not uncommon to see a pub right next to a pub. The benefits of the pub is perhaps the only thing most people in this country agree on. Provided you remember to drink within your limits, a pint down the pub can be a rewarding experience. So far we've explored the pub as a fundamental aspect in collective British culture. But it's not just a UK thing, and it would be criminal to pretend it is. Ireland has no shortage of pubs. Irish pubs have existed for roughly 1,000 years, with the country's oldest pub still open, believed to have been established in the 10th century.
That's so cool.
The Irish pub is famed for its cosy atmosphere, fulfilling drink and traditional music.
And I can't wait to get to Ireland myself. They're actually starting direct flights from Cleveland here in Ohio, which is about an hour away from me, over to Ireland that I might have to take advantage of at some point. But that's cool. And I'm curious to know, those of you who have experienced both, is there a difference between the typical Irish pub and the typical British pub. Now, I know Northern Ireland's part of the UK, but specifically Ireland. I'm curious to know if there are any differences.
Irish pubs pride themselves on professionalism but also informality. Big chain and brewery ownership is far less common, and their appeal is so great that it's not uncommon to find Irish-themed bars around the world.
Yeah.
The pub is just as much a part of Ireland's social culture as it is in Britain. It's a place where people come together. The Irish pub has its own history, which may be worth its own video at some point, but you get the idea. It's not 100% exclusively a Britain thing. The pub is a pillar of a community, a local establishment where people always find themselves, whether they're regulars who know every other regular by name, or newcomers passing through or having a bev somewhere new to them. The pub is where everybody is welcome, unless you're a troublemaker who's been barred. As with everything, boozing does have its downsides, but hopefully the pub will be a part of our lives until the day we die.
That was good. I really enjoyed that. Remember to drink responsibly
Thanks
and
for watching
support your
this
local.
video.
Cheers.
But please remember,
Or as they say in Germany, Prost. So yeah, that was cool. I really enjoyed that. And again, hope you guys will check out the channel Decades. If you like the 2 videos that I've reacted to, I think you'll like some of the other stuff that they've got. They've got some really cool topics that they have chosen to cover in these videos. The link is in the description. Go over there, give them a subscription, watch at least 5 of their videos, and give them some support. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.